plus the stock that drives everything at the moment. That's NVIDIA. I was just kind of eyeballing it because I know this has been one of the best performing stocks clearly over the last couple of years in the S&P 500, in the NASDAQ 100. Seemingly, even though it's all-time high, it's been a quieter year, especially given that it had such a tough start. But I'm just eyeballing it. It's easily still in the top 10% of performers or so for the S&P 500, up over 30%. I mean, you cannot hold this stock down. It's like one of those, floaties. You hold it underwater. The second you take the force off, it's back to the top.
It's the life preserver effect, right? You can't hold it down. NVIDIA's got quite a lot of headlines driving today, too. We talk a lot about this headline-driven market. NVIDIA always seems to be a part of the conversation. One, in part because of their size. Two, in part because of their scope. And three, in part because they're so heavily involved in the AI and semi space. So their hands are in a little bit of everything. This news is a little bit different, though. So, of course, let's start with here in America. The latest is President Trump has now signaled that he would be open to allowing NVIDIA to sell a downgraded version of its Blackwell system chip, which is its most advanced artificial intelligence chip, to China. But they would have to reduce the performance of that chip somehow. Trump plans to meet with Jensen Huang regarding that chip, saying that it would have to be enhanced in what he calls a negative way, saying, for example, that they would need to take 30 to 50% off of it. Now, what that specifically means is still unclear, but he wants it to be less productive than it currently is to be sold. Trump also called the Blackwell chip the, quote, latest and the greatest in the world. This comes, of course, after NVIDIA and AMD agreed to pay the U.S. government a 15% cut of revenues from their chip sales in China in exchange for that export license that they've been waiting on because chip sales had been banned. Trump initially said he asked for a 20% cut. That number came down to 15%, saying that Jensen Huang negotiated that number, so giving some credit there. Still unsure what the downgraded Blackwell chip capabilities would be, if it could still be used in the same way. That's not really sure. In the meantime, in China, Huawei is developing its own Ascend series of processors, which are meant to try to compete with NVIDIA as an alternative. Staying in China, there's another headline news story here. So stay with us.
Trying to keep track.
We're breaking this all down. Now we're moving to China. Chinese authorities have reportedly sent letters to lots of local companies asking them to avoid using NVIDIA's H20 processors, particularly for anything that's government related. They're asking them not to use that. That, of course, would then complicate NVIDIA's attempts to try to recoup the billions of dollars in Chinese revenue it lost when Trump banned chip sales in China. Over the past few weeks, they've sent letters to a range of firms discouraging the use, with a particularly strong discouragement against any H20 usage in government or national security related work by state enterprises or private companies. Now, President Trump has referred to the H20 as obsolete, but says that there's still a market for it in China. They did not constitute an outright ban. The letters reported don't say they're banned, but they're highly discouraging it. And also no mention whether or not AMD's MI308 chip was specifically mentioned or not. But the H20 was definitely mentioned. On that news, shares of companies like Cambricon Technologies, a Chinese semi firm, surged to their 20% daily limit on that news. Now, this is really interesting given that move that the U.S. government now plans to take a cut of revenues, because this could certainly cut into that share of revenues. And also still not sure if any Chinese companies are ready to jump ship to local semiconductors, or if those local semis have those same capabilities.
President Donald Trump has said that if NVIDIA reduces its capabilities by 30% to 50%, he could be willing to allow the firm to export a less sophisticated version of its most sophisticated Blackwell AI processor to China. The remark follows Trump's confirmation of an odd deal already in place for NVIDIA's weaker H20 chip, which permits shipments to China in return for a 15% revenue share that is paid to the U.S. government directly. According to a person with knowledge of the situation, Advanced Micro Devices will use the same formula for its MI308 chip. Regarding the president's comments, NVIDIA has remained silent. The possible agreement for Blackwell would reflect Trump's larger effort to obtain economic benefits for the U.S. in return for easing some export controls, a tactic that may have an impact on how U.S. businesses bargain for access to the Chinese market. Trump indicated that he could meet with NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang shortly to discuss a negatively improved Blackwell variant, but he did not provide a time frame. If accepted, the action might change the way that premium U.S. semiconductor technology is selectively sold overseas. The core of today's most potent AI systems are NVIDIA's Blackwell processors, which are currently prohibited from entering China because to U.S. regulations. Tighter regulations have reduced exports to older models that are comparable to domestic Chinese rivals that have had difficulty gaining traction, hurting income for both NVIDIA and AMD. NVIDIA has already stated that it is creating a new chip designed just for China and will apply for permission to market it. A redesigned Blackwell may be the most obvious way to regain traction in one of the biggest AI marketplaces in the world, the company said, adding that further reducing its Hopper-based H20 chip is no longer feasible. However, after the Trump administration overturned an effective U.S. prohibition on such sales, Beijing has pushed local businesses to refrain from using NVIDIA Corp's H20 processors, especially for government-related activities. This has complicated the chip maker's return to China. So what implications does this have for NVIDIA's stock? Let's explore that. But first, a big thank you to those of you who've stuck with us this far. Creating these videos takes significant effort and dedication, so if you're enjoying the content, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts on NVIDIA stock in the comments. Your support truly helps us grow. Now let's get back to the video. According to persons familiar with the situation, Chinese officials have been sending notifications to various companies in recent weeks to discourage the use of the less sophisticated semiconductors. According to the persons, who asked not to be named because the information is sensitive, the guidelines were especially strict about state firms and private companies using H20s for any government or national security-related activity. However, the people claimed that the letters did not amount to a complete prohibition on the use of H20. Generally speaking, industry analysts concur that Chinese businesses continue to need those chips because they are highly effective in some essential AI applications. Despite labeling the processor outdated, President Donald Trump stated on Monday that it still has a market in the Asian nation. Both NVIDIA and AMD recently received Washington's consent to start selling lower-end AI chips to China again, but with the contentious and dubious requirement that they give the U.S. government a 15% share of the profits. Despite having Trump's staff on board, the two businesses still have to contend with Beijing's push on its Chinese clients to buy homegrown chips instead. Although it's unclear if any letters directly named AMD's MI308 chip, one of the insiders claimed that Beijing's general effort affects AI accelerators from AMD in addition to NVIDIA. Following the announcement of China's guidelines, shares of Cambricon Technologies Corp., a Chinese AI chip designer, jumped to their daily limit of 20%, sparking a rise in peers like Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corp. Beijing's position might make it more difficult for Trump to use his reversal on export restriction to boost government revenue, an agreement that demonstrated his administration's transactional approach to national security issues that have always been seen as non-negotiable. However, Chinese businesses might not be prepared to switch to domestic semiconductors just yet. According to Ho Min Lee, a senior macro strategist at Lombard Odier in Singapore, chips from domestic manufacturers are improving dramatically in quality, but they might not be as versatile for specific workloads that China's domestic AI industry hopes to focus on. Lee went on to say that he expects strong demand for the processors that NVIDIA and AMD are permitted to sell under the Trump administration. According to Kevin Cassidy, an analyst at Rosenblatt Securities, Chinese companies are going to want to use the best chips available. Thus, he doesn't think NVIDIA's processor sales to China would be impacted. He claimed that local alternatives to NVIDIA and AMD's chips were inferior. According to one of the people, Beijing questioned companies about that matter in some of its letters, asking them questions like why they choose to purchase NVIDIA H20 chips instead of local ones, if it's a necessary decision given domestic alternatives, and if they've discovered any security flaws in the NVIDIA hardware. Reports in the state media that question the security and dependability of H20 processors are in line with the notices. NVIDIA, which has consistently disputed that its chips have such flaws, has been personally contacted by Chinese regulators about such worries. According to the Financial Times, in response to the letters, several Chinese corporations want to reduce their orders of NVIDIA processors. According to the People, China's strictest chip regulations are currently only applicable to sensitive applications. This situation is comparable to Beijing's restrictions on Tesla Inc. cars and Apple Inc. iPhones in specific establishments and areas due to security concerns. At one point, the Chinese government even prohibited the use of semiconductors made by Micron Technology Inc. in vital infrastructure. According to one individual with direct knowledge of the discussions, Beijing may expand its stricter guidelines for NVIDIA and AMD to a broader range of settings, though the discussions are still in their early phases. NVIDIA claimed in a statement that the H20 is not a military product or for government infrastructure, while AMD declined to comment on Beijing's notifications. According to NVIDIA, China has a large supply of its own processors and has never relied on American chips for government functions. Based on interviews with over 6 people familiar with Beijing's policy talks, were not answered by China's Cyberspace Administration or the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. A request for comment from the White House was not answered. The Trump administration's rationale for permitting those exports just months after essentially outlawing them is called into question by the Chinese government's stance. Although Beijing has openly said that the resumed H-20 supplies were not a part of any bilateral agreement, some senior U.S. officials have stated that their policy shift was the consequence of trade discussions with China. China may not have initially asked Washington for such a concession, according to subsequent letters sent to businesses. Beijing is worried about 2 things. To begin with, Chinese authorities are concerned that NVIDIA chips would be able to track a user's location and remotely shut off devices, a possibility that NVIDIA has strongly refuted. Lawmakers have sponsored a measure that would mandate location verification for advanced AI chips, and Trump officials are aggressively investigating whether location tracking could assist reduce alleged smuggling of prohibited components into China. Second, Beijing wants Chinese businesses to switch from Western chips to local ones because it is very keen on enhancing its domestic chip capabilities. According to a September Bloomberg story, officials have previously pushed Chinese companies to select homegrown chips over NVIDIA H20 processors and have instituted energy efficiency requirements that the H20 chip does not fulfill. In order to comply with years of U.S. limitations on sales of its more sophisticated hardware, restrictions intended to prevent Beijing's access to AI that could be advantageous to the Chinese military, NVIDIA created the H20 processor especially for Chinese consumers. Although the H20 processor lacks the processing capability of NVIDIA's best products, its large memory bandwidth makes it ideal for the inference phase of AI research when models identify trends and make deductions. In China, where local chip leader Huawei Technologies company is finding it difficult to develop enough cutting-edge components to fulfill market demand, this has made it a coveted product for businesses like Alibaba Group Holding Limited and Tencent Holdings Limited. Losing access to the NVIDIA processor would make it 3 to 6 times more expensive for Chinese enterprises to do inference on sophisticated AI models, according to a calculation made by Biden officials who thought about but did not impose curbs on H20 sales. Of China's campaign for businesses to steer clear of American AI chips, Leonard Heim, an AI-focused researcher at RAND, said Beijing seems to be utilizing regulatory uncertainty to create a captive market large enough to absorb Huawei's supply, while yet permitting purchases of H20s to fulfill genuine demands. This indicates that despite China's pressure on foreign providers, domestic options are still insufficient. Trump's remarks on Monday echoed earlier statements made by his administration officials, who have partially justified the decision to resume H20 exports by claiming that China's Huawei already provides chips that are comparable to the NVIDIA H20. These officials argue that in order to deny Huawei the cash and expertise that would come from a larger customer base, the U.S. should continue to make the Chinese AI ecosystem dependent on less developed American technology. According to Bloomberg, other administration officials have vehemently disagreed with that reasoning, claiming that restoring H20 exports will only strengthen China's computing power overall and give confidence to its tech champions. Despite the Trump team's prior claims that such an agreement wasn't on the table, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and other Trump officials have also asserted that the H20 relocation was a part of an agreement to increase American access to Chinese rare earth minerals. Lutnick stated last month that the H20s will be removed after the Chinese delivered their magnets. In late July, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent declared that the magnet problem was solved, after NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang met with the president and both firms agreed to split their China revenue with the U.S. government. The first NVIDIA H20 and AMD MI308 licenses arrived just over a week after Bessent's announcement. Don't forget to share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your input helps create a more knowledgeable community where we can all learn and grow together in the world of investing. Stay up to date with the latest market trends, insights, and key updates by subscribing to Investing Tutorial. We're here to help you make smarter investment decisions and stay ahead of the curve.
Here, and sort of my initial thoughts are, obsolete is probably a strong word, but I think it gets the tone, which is how quickly this stuff's advancing and all the billions that are being spent, and then it's like they quickly replace them with the new one a year or two later. But I also wonder from an NVIDIA perspective, if you're making the Blackwells, you've got your, TSMC and everybody, full speed ahead to make these. After you get through the H20 inventory that you have, does it make more sense to just have sort of a geopolitically, dumbed down, whatever word you want to use, restricted version that's easier to produce because you're already making Blackwells? So just from a situation like, are they going to continue to make H20s once they get through the inventory? Probably not. And so it's like, okay, can we make something that's approved? And whether that is the same chip with restrictions, whatever it may be, or less capacity, it does make sense. But it also, you could see how this is sort of the give an inch, take a mile situation. It's a constantly moving and ever-changing negotiation. What I like to do, I just look over that NVIDIA stock price and it's still green.
Mm-hmm. It's still green. It's still up. I mean, closer to the unchanged line than I think we normally see. But it is very interesting timing. NVIDIA is such a late reporter in the quarter. They'll report on August 27th. So it's very interesting here because there will likely be a ton of questions on the call. Even though this isn't actually a part of the quarter, we are going to get that full tariff impact. We are going to get that full impact of that chip ban on sales. Even though they gave a guesstimate or an estimate of what it was going to be, we will likely get more details about whether or not they will make H20 when they run out. What the Blackwell reduction or negative,
whatever, the China approved,
the Chinese Blackwell chip, if that ever becomes a thing, what that could look like, and in the next 2 weeks before that happens, maybe we'll get some clarity about what those sales could potentially look like. If there's a negotiation for a lower revenue cut, if they do that, a lot of possible scenarios here. Very interesting timing in that they haven't reported earnings yet.
I think it's also important, it's kind of the unwritten part of this, an unspoken part, which is the U.S. and China are also within negotiations themselves. And in many ways, companies like NVIDIA, companies like Boeing, different Chinese companies, they're all sort of chess pieces on this board. And so if it feels like NVIDIA got a win and the Trump administration got a win and China wants to make it like, hey, push back a little bit, they can say things like this. And so some of it is just like the regular back and forth, and we got 90 more days of this at least, probably more. And like I said, sometimes just watching NVIDIA, watching the stock prices can cut through some of that noise for us. And I think it's going to be a fascinating earnings release at the end of this month. But I got a quick example trade. Hard to argue with the performance of NVIDIA. Like I said, over the last few years, one of the best performers, the best performer if we're being honest, especially when it comes to market cap appreciation. Selling a put vertical neutral to bullish, staying ahead of that earnings event. It's due out at the end of the month. So just going out to next week's August 22nd expiration here, neutral to bullish strategy, short put vertical, 180, 177.5. So smaller trade, shorter term trade as we kind of get ready for that big event at the end of the month. Looking to collect 75 cents on a $2.50 wide spread. Risk $175, chance to make 75. Break even 179.25. So you got about let's call it 1.5%, 2%, but $3 in cushion here to the downside, and you can make $75 over the next couple weeks per spread on that 175 in risk. And I know one thing's for sure, NVIDIA, it's on the watch list because it has to be. It's moving the market every single day.